Hello, thanks for joining me here today. It's a pleasure to have you. Please do leave a comment and let me know who you are, where you're joining from. It'd be really kind of great to kind of get a feel for who you guys are and who's interested in this sort of thing. Okay, so the elephant in the room, policy is a kind of dull thing to make it sound sexy, but I'm going to try and at least get your attention. So just bear with me for a minute. So to set the scene, I'm in a lift. Yes, American friends, we really do call them lifts. And 4 people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the doors close, I position myself in front of them. A captive audience. They're mine. I've got them. I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important to. I gesture to her. See? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. She nods. Oh, perfect. The CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. Well, what are the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? Well, I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? And she tells me, I don't know what teams are really doing, what the volume of risk is, and what I should be showing more interest in. Setting and changing policy is often slow and hard to communicate. And people ultimately just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better. And to be honest, often they do. But ultimately, I'm then left playing catch up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, trying not to sound like a patronising snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person in a suit. They look maybe slightly less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, it's my imagination here. It'd be weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. They nod. The whip cracker, I say. What's important to you? So managing risk, kind of mostly opportunity risk. So the fear of missing out, getting features out the door and avoiding getting bogged down with, they glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that feels though it's almost designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO. Before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, they say. How did you get in my imaginary lift today? Okay, I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person. Hoodie, headphones around their neck. My stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. What code do you write? I ask. It doesn't really matter. Python. Cool. Have you got everything updated to I work with? I pause. Python 3 they offer? Yes. Python 3. That must be hard, I add. They don't know it yet, but I've kind of just won a bit of their trust, which is important. Nearly, they say. Cool. What's important to you? So staying on top of patching things so we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what ones I can bend, break, and ultimately what might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code and avoiding technical debt. The rest of my team being able to cohesively work as one. Do you use any tools to help you with that, I ask? Yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage, the kind of usual kind of remit. Great, I say. I wrote code too. Let's be friends. And I hand them a printed QR code. Here's my public GPG key. So you know that you can trust what I say. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and then when it changes? Well, we get a memo or something stuck to the notice board. Last week, we got a memo saying that all the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. But how does that then work out for you? Well, it's up to us to then maintain that to-do list so we can onboard new people and just kind of keep a list of what we're up to. Does it go wrong at all? Yeah, sometimes if when we compile that operational manual and we miss a memo or don't apply everything all in the right sequence, we get things wrong. They glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the 3rd floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all their boards down. I looked to the dev. Does that sound familiar? They nod. Turns out we're not all special snowflakes, hey? All is not lost. I knew there was a reason that I imagined you here today. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looking at it to me, ready to buy literally whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out of the way, so to stop obstructing the door, I don't work here. I'm just here to fix the lift. People have been complaining it only goes to the top floor no matter what button they push, and it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs, and the door shuts. I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of that sounds a bit familiar and you can relate to my imaginary friends, I may have some answers for you today. So what if I said you could update policy easily, even releasing several version updates, not just in a year, a month? What about 10 updates in a single day, and then seamlessly communicate that to the people that need to consume it without derailing them? You could have visibility on compliance using tools that you maybe already use, and that policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, make sense, and not be bureaucratic to change when it needs to, and not ultimately going to get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter. So you can run compliance checks locally in CI and then ultimately kind of guard production. That multiple versions of the policy, like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's known vulnerability type updates are in effect a business as usual activity in order to actually communicate to those that need to know. Does it sound interesting? Great. Let's crack on. So hopefully I've got at least a little bit of your attention. It's time to introduce myself and start explaining things. So my name is Chris Nesbitt-Smith. I'm currently an instructor at LearnK8 and also Control Plane, a consultant to the Crown Prosecution Service, which is part of UK government, and a tinkerer of open source things. I've spent a fair chunk of my kind of professional career now working across kind of UK government and large organisations where problems like this are rife. I've been promised we'll have time to be able to kind of handle questions and heckles or whatever, so please do leave those in the chat as we kind of go, and I'll be around to try and do my best to respond to them. If I don't can't get back to you, then please find me on LinkedIn or message me somehow. So, while this is not a live or in-person recording where I could ask you to say raise your hands, we can still try some audience participation. So, if you could leave me a comment of policy maker if you're with my CIO and have ever set, written, or applied policy before. So if you've ever written, set, or kind of applied some policy before, say like some coding styles or anything else like cloud policy, whatever, things like that. Anything like that, if you've written it or applied it or implemented it, can you write policy maker in the chat? All right, policy maker. Cool. Hopefully I've given you enough time. So next round. If you've ever maybe sought exemption or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever a policy with, hopefully, let's just say maybe some at least good intentions, could you leave a comment of policy breaker in the chat? So if you've ever kind of worked around a policy, done a workaround, circumvented it, found a loophole, anything like that, kind of hacked around with it, policy breaker. Well, great. You fell for it, hopefully, if I've got anyone to do this. So we've got all of your names and employers' details down, thanks to the organisers. So you can put your phones down, lend me your ears, give me your full attention. Ultimately, the stakes just got raised. So where do I see policy as code generally going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, like data at rest being encrypted, for example. Or maybe consistency enforcing, such as code style with tabs being 2 or 4 spaces, perhaps. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. Hopefully, well, with the best of intentions, though, these are often emotionally led rather than being grounded in like a proportionate control, which then lends itself well to being the open door to case-by-case exemptions being required when you come against a situation that you weren't expecting. So this actually is not unlike how typically the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex, if not impossible to navigate rulebook, and then ultimately then harder still to measure for compliance. Can often look like the thin end of a wedge where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous, with others looking to expand upon its scope. Which can lead us to sometimes wonder if the cure was worse than the disease. But that's not how we at least typically develop software. So why does this sort of code have to be so hard? There must be a better answer. Well, we codified everything else, so isn't that the answer? Well, yes, in part, but my point of this talk is that we do it wrong. So maybe some of you are out there kind of screaming or maybe even typing your favorite product name at me as the solution. And you're not kind of wholly wrong necessarily, but the devil's in the detail. Throwing some curly braces or YAML at something doesn't inherently fix things. So if it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep that policy a secret. Exposing it could be used against you perhaps as an adversary. However, that does not support us in the kind of shift left culture at all. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what that policy might be by finding out when we kind of smash our heads up against it and the thing says no. And therefore, it doesn't take much imagination to see that in the scenario of an application deployed, midway through, finding one of the resources is non-compliant and gets rejected would leave the overall deployment in an inconsistent halfway state. This could result in some downtime. Which begs the question of, was that policy better than the downtime to the business? Especially if that consequently leads our engineers, who are all hopefully all plenty smart at finding inventive, should we say, ways around the computer says no response that they'd got. This is then further exasperated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong, so you form that case law and need to apply a new policy. So maybe all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered a breaking one. Sure, you might say that you provide warnings on at least the less important issues or new emerging policy, which is great so long as someone sees them. But if you've adopted GitOps or at least CI/CD in some guise, is anyone seeing those warnings? So who studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I'd probably politely suggest that you're kind of missing the point of CI/CD. You should really be able to trust your job status. Okay, well, I'm not just here to throw stones. So if you remember my implied promises to my four imaginary friends of what the kind of utopian promised land might look like, well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've actually already unwittingly solved most, if not all, of these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and kind of join the dots up and remember that it's code and it's software. So, well, if the first is, if it's something you're probably doing kind of policy as code, probably you're doing. So put it in version control. The thing you might not be doing, though, is making that visible. So at least in a source set, by which I mean anyone within your walled garden of employees, suppliers, subcontractors, whatever, to see the policy. I'm not saying give all your threat monitoring and intel away. You can probably keep that to yourselves, but I'd argue that the visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the downtime, reverse-engineered workarounds, and opaque legacied exemption spaghetti soup. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You will find that it unlocks the ability to work well with prospective suppliers without NDAs and whatnot, and widely distributed secrets are often expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and often only stay secret for so long after all. Okay, well, we're off to a good start. Our policy is visible now to those that need to see it. Many of you, no doubt, are used to semantic versioning, but a quick recap. The first segment is used to indicate breaking, perhaps conflicting change. In the context of policy, let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. Maybe that will help with some internal cross-charging. Who knows? I'm not judging. An increment to that might look like requiring that to be from a predetermined list rather than just be free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes that shouldn't really break anyone. And increments this might look like correcting a spelling mistake on one of the department names. The third segment is to indicate patch changes, so these should be a no-brainer for everyone to keep up to date with. And increments that might look like adding a department to the available options. Okay, so our policy is visible. It's in a repository now. It's versioned, so we can easily communicate that policy. We can tack on the release notes, and expectations are all managed by semantic versioning. In software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if your policy was just another dependency? So you might unwittingly already be doing this if, for example, you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, for example. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repo, it's versioned, we can easily communicate it, we can tack on the release notes, and expectations are managed by semantic versioning. It's beginning to look a lot more like software. Okay, I know testing is a dirty word, but in order to make this an asset that everyone can depend upon, it's also important to have some good examples, and tests are essential to give everyone confidence in the stability and surface any potential side effects before they hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against the policy locally and also in CI/CD. Thus shortening the feedback loop and better informing things. And as a bonus, we should therefore find ourselves and our consumers able to rely on that artifact that we're sharing with them. Well, we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. We can even use some magic like GitHub's Dependaput or Men's Renovate to do that for us. So think automatic pull request tests, even auto merging if you like. Okay, so to check you're all still awake, can anyone leave me a comment and let me know of a recent event that caused people to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? You can leave me a comment. Let me know what that is, what that topic and theme of that is. Yep, as you know, all presentations this year are contractually required to reference log4j, even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some memes about it. In just a few short months, I can remove these and hopefully just point broadly at a list of scary-looking CVEs in order to command your behaviour through fear. What I'm getting at here, though, is the situational awareness piece around software supply chain is something your organisation is hopefully already thinking about, if not already addressing. So if our policy is a dependency, this is at least not a new problem. Software kind of bill of materials for the win, right? Which ultimately gives us the ability to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've just covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded vaguely convincing. And this isn't just a fictional utopia that's been painted in PowerPoints. Well, it's time to look at how you might be actually able to do this. And I know you really came here wanting to see a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji or two that you've seen up till now. So we've reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! To maintain the scope, though, I'm going to be limiting this to talking about two things to prove that it's not just one tech or tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes, but I could have picked anything. And naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm generally too lazy to kind of invent too much here. So likewise, I'm going to pick two tools. But again, I could have used any, some, or even all probably. So Checkov is going to be doing my Terraform and Caverno will be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, I've created a example GitHub organization here. I'm not expecting you to read or grok the code on screen too much, so don't worry about it, really. It's just to prove that I've made a real thing. So the policy is stored here. So here's where my policy starts, at version 1.0. I've got policy that requires a department label on all the resources. So as long as it's set, it doesn't actually matter what it is. I've written tests for this, so note how the parsing test cases are really useful as a great example of what good and bad looks like. We pushed a tag in Git, we've added release notes, I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires. Obviously it does, but moving on. Version 2.00 looks similar, only now that the department field has to be one of a predetermined list. Like before, tests exist, release notes are written, tags are signed. 2.1.0 is where we notice and correct that spelling mistake of one of the options in the list of the departments. 2.1.1, and we've now added a new department to the list. And app1 and infra1 are some other repositories in that org. Well, those depend on version 1.00 of the policy. It's if it's not compliant with version 2.00 or beyond, but how do I know that it's not compliant with version 2? Well, I configured renovate to actually be able to automatically make me a pull request. So when there's a new version of the policy, it's super obvious if I can update my dependency, and I can also see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can also see all the pull requests over my org, so I can now measure the compliance of my policy. So moving on from that, app2 as other repositories and infra2, other repository, they depend on version 2.00 of the policy. However, we could merge the open pull request there all the way up to 2.1.1. Finally, app3 and infra3, well, they're dependent on 2.1.1, and they get a gold star from the CIO. So there is a small touch of magic here, and it's not pretty. I've written some bash. So don't judge me, even though definitely, absolutely written a lot worse. But what this does is allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy. Ideally, this might be a bit less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests and collaboration are very welcome. And the last piece to the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of the policy to coexist, be accepted and evaluated within a single runtime. I cheated a bit here. Kubernetes gives you admission controllers. It's not so easy to get that same policy evaluation in a cloud done locally. They've got their own policy engines, and I've just not figured out a way to be able to execute and evaluate that locally. Again, pull requests, collaboration, contribution are really all very welcome in this space, and I'd love to hear from you. So you may have noticed the way the policy is actually designed and written and distributed lends itself well to coexist with itself in a Kubernetes cluster. Which brings us to cluster 1, which describes a cluster that accepts all of the versions we've described in the cluster. So, all the versions of the policy that we've described so far. And the reason that's happened is I've applied all of those policies. Likewise, cluster 2 exists. However, this only accepts 2.00 and greater. And we can automate some of this and to prove the point by using kind for some CI to apply that policy and deploy our applications. And there we have it, a full organization, all done, wrapped up, compliant, policy all versions, CIO, all aware of what's going on, everyone well communicated with. So this sounds great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if the policy carried a story about why it exists? After all, if your agile delivery teams are even half effective, they should be rejecting anything that they perceive as friction if they don't see the value in it. It could allow our developers to know why they're compliant. And if they want to do something outside of what the policy permits, they don't need any sort of exemption granted per se. They can actually go and have a well-reasoned and informed debate with the rationale behind a pull request to the policy that is attached to a understood risk of why the policy exists. So if you imagine, if you will, the things that is going through a stage of versions with risks that inform kind of the mitigations manifested as the policy, all maintained as kind of one living thing. So when the risk landscape changes, your policy can move with it. So, for example, when some new privacy regulation comes out or your latest marketing strategy pays off and you acquire more data, even if your policy was perfect at one point in time, the risks and the appetite will stand still for no one. So we can liken this in some ways to over-provisioning that we might be familiar with from elsewhere, where lead times are long, change is hard, and there is a significant pressure in nailing it the first time, which can lead us to hedging bets against what that future state might be, rather than proportionate mitigation to the risks that are actually more tangibly in the real right now. So that's where the real culture change is needed. And the execution of that is likely a long series of talks in of itself. So now this is really all over to you. Honestly, the best thing that you could do right now is tell me this is all madness, already done, irrelevant, or just otherwise unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber of peers have kind of yet to do. But beyond making pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building some test cases with other willing organizations, and that will allow me to kind of swap out more of my imaginary friends for some real ones. But the most important thing that I want you to remember from our time together today is, and please do feel free to say this out loud with me, purposeless policy is potentially practically pointless policy. I've been practicing saying that far too many times. I've been Chris Nesbitt-Smith. Thank you so much for your time. You're now free to disconnect and leave. I will work with the organisers to make sure the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier are destroyed. I'll try. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn, GitHub, and whatever. You can be rest assured that there'll be no spam or really much content at all, since I'm pretty awful at self-promotion, especially on social media. cns.me, that just points to my LinkedIn, and talks.cns.me contains this and some other talks. They're all open source on my GitHub. Questions are very welcome on this or anything else. I'll be around in the comments for a while. So please do, please kind of reach out or ping me a message on LinkedIn. It'd be great to hear from you and hear what your thoughts are. Thank you very much.